Gosh, I hope Jennifer's doing okay. She seems to be having an awfully rough life. Hark! The Bailreth is aglow! I wonder where it's taking me! No, not here! Wrong IP! Get me out of here before the Warner Brothers find me! Back in the 1970s, when Christopher Tolkien was embarking upon the monumental task of organizing many of his late father's unpublished writings into the Silmarillion, he turned to a young Canadian philosophy student named Guy Gavriel Kay for assistance. So Guy packed a bag and popped over to England to help in the editing of the Silmarillion. The Fionavar Tapestry is a fantasy trilogy written by Guy Gavriel Kay, consisting of The Darkest Road, The Wandering Fire, and The Summer Tree. It is high fantasy, very much in the tradition of Tolkien, and Tolkien's influence is definitely very strong in this series. To describe the trilogy, I generally say it's a cross between The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia, and with some real human relationships and sex thrown in, though they seem to largely be straight relationships because this is fantasy and not real life after all. So this is a series that was recommended to me quite a while back by my local bookstop owner, and I avoided it because there's this anachronistic switching between a modern day setting and a somewhat medievalish fantasy world. This didn't sound terribly appealing to me because of my experiences with the Chronicles of Narnia when I was younger. I never did love that switching between the more modern day and fantasy settings. Every time they came out of the fantasy world, it felt like they were breaking the magic, or like you could see that second bunny under the magician's sleeve there. There was just something about bringing you out of that setting that I always found a bit jarring, I guess. But the more of Guy's other works I read, the more I realized I really had to give this series a try. And you know what? The mix of the real world and fantasy really does work well within this series. In fact, I found myself wishing that Guy Kay would take the time to write books in the other worlds that are briefly alluded to within the story here. So right up front, I'll say that I loved this trilogy. There were several things I enjoyed about it. One is the fact that there were several very strong female characters in the book. Despite there still being a sea of men throughout the story, there were definitely female characters who played pivotal roles within the narrative. Now, math isn't my strong point, but in comparison to a book like The Hobbit, which has 0 female characters, this seems to represent a several thousand% improvement. Another thing that I really enjoyed about the writing in this series is the connected overarching narrative. Other fantasy series that I've read tend to represent a bit of a journey where the characters will start at one point, they'll have a number of seemingly random, unconnected experiences along the way, and then they'll reach their destination and get whatever they were looking for at the end. And there isn't necessarily a sense that the individual events that are occurring within the story are all interconnected. However, with the Fionavar Tapestry, as in any masterfully told story, all the events that happen within the story are all intertwined and interconnected within a broader narrative, which was really cool. For the ability to craft an intricate and layered narrative, I find it hard to beat John Irving, but Guy Kay is definitely in that top tier of storytellers that I really appreciate so much. Another thing that I wasn't necessarily expecting out of the series was that it would be a real page-turner. When you read an epic fantasy story, there's a lot of world building that happens in order to take you into this setting and the locations and the creatures that are in it. And you don't necessarily think it's going to be much of a thriller per se, but with this series, I just blasted through it. Once the story got rolling, the action just kept actioning right through to the end, and it really kept my interest right throughout this series. So there were also some interesting themes woven through this story. Besides the obvious influence of Tolkien, other legends and myths do find new life within the Fionavar Tapestry, such as the Norse Yggdrasil being reworked as the summer tree. But the central theme of the series is free will. In a world of gods, how much are these sentient races masters of their own fate? This is a concept that's popular in various philosophies and religions, and it shouldn't be much of a surprise that this theme shows up from a former philosophy student like Kay. There's a second major theme that I actually don't even want to mention in order to avoid any spoilers, so I'll just sort of pass that one by. But yeah, there's certainly some interesting themes within the narrative here. Now, I do have to interject with one difficult thing. I do highly recommend this series, but I can't recommend it without including a warning. For me personally, nothing will get me to discard a book faster than incorporating sexual violence within the story. I have a hard time seeing the purpose of including that within an entertainment medium, especially if it's a male writer writing about sexual violence enacted upon a female character. I have a really hard time stomaching that sort of thing personally, and that does show up at one point within the first book. When I read it, my first instinct was to literally tear it out of the book, but that particular event is such a pivotal moment for what happens throughout the entire rest of the series that it really does have to be there for the narrative to make sense. And if there's any redemption at all that can happen with this sort of thing, the character who is the victim takes something that could have destroyed her and really allows herself to become empowered by the resulting events that occur in the aftermath of this horrific event. So yeah, it's hard to absorb, and the reader should definitely be aware that that scene is there. But I guess it's really the first time that I could sort of accept something like that being in a work of fiction that I've read. So now that I've covered that, I will say that this is amongst the best works of fiction I've ever read, period. In terms of the high fantasy I've read, it's at the top of my list at this point. It's not necessarily my favorite fantasy I've ever read. That honor would actually go to another two-part series by Guy Kay called The Sarantine Mosaic, which is not high fantasy. It's more of a almost historical fiction with a little bit of fantasy woven in. It's not as much of a page-turner as the Fionavar Tapestry, but I feel like The Sarantine Mosaic is just a little bit more interesting in the themes that it explores, and it's just a tad less melodramatic than the writing we find in this high fantasy series. But I'll talk about that one in another video sometime. And meanwhile, I do think that the Fionavar Tapestry is more accessible to a wider audience than the Sarantine Mosaic is, and I do highly recommend it, obviously. So if you are a fantasy fan, definitely check it out. Oh hey, Josh here, just wanting to thank you for sticking around right through to the end of the video. I really appreciate that. If you want to support me, you can give me a thumb up on the video. It would be great if you would share this video with one book lover in your life, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Cheers. She seems to be having an awfully rough life. Hark! Oh, it's not. Come on now. No, get me out of here! Wrong IP! Oh, shoot. To describe glasses.